The hunger in Margaret Grayson's belly was an enemy more formidable than any outlaw who'd ever passed through Sioux Falls, South Dakota territory. It gnawed at her insides with relentless teeth as she stared at the last morsel of stale bread on her small wooden table, enough to silence the pain for perhaps an hour, but no more. The year was 1876, and the frontier town of Sioux Falls was still reeling from the economic panic that had swept across the nation 3 years prior. For most, times were hard. For Margaret, they were impossible. She glanced around the small one-room cabin her father had built before the fever took him and her mother both last winter. The barren cupboards mocked her, as did the dress laid out on her bed, the finest she owned, though it was patched in 3 places. The letter beside it, written in the slanted hand of Josiah Blackwater, the town's wealthiest businessman, offered her a position that would feed her well. It would also, she knew, starve her soul. A lady of companionship, he'd called it when he'd cornered her outside the general store yesterday. His eyes had roved over her figure with a hunger different from but no less intense than her own. His establishment on the edge of town served whiskey to men and offered women as a side attraction. Margaret had seen the hollow eyes of those women when they ventured into town for supplies. The bread disappeared in 2 desperate bites. Margaret ran her hands along the rough fabric of her dress and wondered what it would feel like to never be hungry again. She wondered, too, what it would cost to look at herself in the mirror afterward. A knock at the door startled her from these dark contemplations. "Miss Grayson," a deep voice called. "Are you home?" Margaret straightened her worn cotton dress and opened the door to find a tall figure silhouetted against the bright Dakota sunlight. As her eyes adjusted, she took in the man before her, trail-worn boots and denim trousers, a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows revealing tanned, muscular forearms. A cowboy hat hung from a leather cord around his neck, resting against his back, leaving his face uncovered. "I'm Benjamin Xavier," he said, offering a calloused hand. His face was weathered but youthful, perhaps 25 or so, with eyes the color of a summer sky and hair the warm brown of freshly turned earth. "I believe I purchased this land from your father last year." Margaret blinked. "My father never mentioned selling our land." Benjamin Xavier frowned. "He said he was keeping a small parcel for your homestead, but the surrounding acreage." He paused, studying her pale face. "You truly didn't know?" "My father died 3 months ago," she said flatly. "If he sold our land, he never told me where he put the money." The cowboy's eyes softened with understanding. "Miss Grayson, I'm sorry for your loss." He glanced past her into the cabin, taking in its barren state with a quick, assessing look. "May I come in? I believe we have matters to discuss." Margaret hesitated. Propriety dictated she shouldn't allow an unknown man into her home, but propriety wouldn't fill her empty stomach. Besides, she had little left to lose. She stepped aside. "I've just come from meeting with the bank manager," Benjamin explained, removing his hat as he entered. "There seems to be some confusion about the boundaries of the property." "The only confusion, Mr. Xavier, is why you're here claiming land that's been in my family for 8 years, Margaret replied, her spine straightening despite her weakness. Benjamin set his hat on the table and ran a hand through his hair. "Your father sold me 300 acres on the north side of the creek. We signed papers, and I paid him in full. I've been working a cattle drive up in Montana territory since then, but I've returned to establish my ranch." Margaret felt the room spin slightly. Her father had been desperate for money during his final years, watching his crops fail during the drought. But to sell their land without telling her, "I have nothing but your word on this," she said. "The bank has the deed," Benjamin replied gently. "I'm not here to take your home, Miss Grayson. The parcel your cabin sits on wasn't part of our arrangement." "How generous," she said bitterly, then immediately regretted her tone. This wasn't his fault. Benjamin studied her for a moment, his gaze uncomfortably perceptive. "When did you last eat a proper meal, Miss Grayson?" The question stung her pride, but pride was a luxury she could ill afford. "That's not your concern." "I disagree," he said simply. "If we're to be neighbors, your welfare is very much my concern." Margaret laughed, a hollow sound. "Neighbors." "Mr. Xavier, I have no means to plant crops this season, no horse to plow with, no seeds. Even if I did, I'd starve before harvest." Benjamin nodded thoughtfully. "That presents a problem, but perhaps there's a solution that could benefit us both." Margaret stiffened. She'd heard such offers before, most recently from Josiah Blackwater. "What kind of solution?" "I need help establishing my ranch. I have cattle arriving next week, and I'm building a proper house to replace the old line shack on the property. I need someone to cook meals, keep accounts, and help with 100 other tasks. I'll pay a fair wage, provide room and board, and you'll be treated with nothing but respect." Margaret stared at him, searching for the deception in his offer. "You want to hire me as your housekeeper?" "More of a ranch manager, I'd say. I know cattle and horses, but this will be my first time running my own spread. Your father mentioned you were educated." "My mother taught school before she married. She ensured I learned my letters and figures." Benjamin smiled, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "Perfect. So, do we have an agreement?" Margaret hesitated. This stranger was offering her a way out of her impossible situation, one that wouldn't require her to sacrifice her dignity. Yet experience had taught her that nothing came without a price. "I'll need to see this deed you mentioned," she said finally. "And references as to your character." Benjamin laughed, not unkindly. "Practical. I respect that. You can speak to Sheriff Miller about me. I've known him since we were boys in Nebraska. As for the deed, we can visit the bank together tomorrow." Margaret considered the offer. Her options were painfully limited. Accept Blackwater's proposition and lose her self-respect, stay here and slowly starve, or take a chance on this cowboy's offer. "I'll give you 1 month," she decided. "If the arrangement doesn't suit either of us, we part ways with no ill feelings." Benjamin extended his hand. "That seems fair." When Margaret shook it, she was struck by the strength in his grip and the warmth of his skin against hers. For the first time in months, she felt something other than hunger and despair. It might have been hope. "When would I start?" she asked. "How about now?" Benjamin gestured toward the door. "I have supplies in my wagon. Let me make you dinner and we can discuss the details." As they walked outside to his wagon, Margaret noticed the quality of his equipment: sturdy, well-maintained but not flashy. He pulled out a sack of flour, salt pork, coffee beans, and other provisions. "You came prepared," she observed. "I've learned that on the frontier, a man should always carry more than he thinks he'll need," Benjamin replied, hefting the supplies. "The same philosophy applies to helping neighbors." Inside, he efficiently built a fire in her neglected stove while she watched with curiosity. Most men she knew would have expected her to cook, especially after offering her a position as a housekeeper of sorts. "You know your way around a cook stove," she remarked. 8 years on cattle drives teaches a man to be self-sufficient," he replied, measuring coffee into the pot. "Though I won't pretend I wouldn't appreciate better cooking than my own." As Benjamin prepared a simple but hearty meal of biscuits and salt pork gravy, Margaret studied him. His movements were economical, his manner straightforward. Nothing about him suggested deception or ulterior motives, yet experience had taught her caution. "Tell me about this ranch you're planning," she said as they sat down to eat. Benjamin's face brightened with enthusiasm. I'm starting with 50 head of cattle, but I hope to triple that within 2 years. The land has good water access and plenty of grazing. There's timber, too, for building. And you'll do all this alone? Margaret asked, savoring the first real food she'd had in days. I've hired 2 hands who'll arrive with the cattle. Good men I worked with in Montana. Benjamin hesitated. Your father spoke highly of you, you know, said you had a sharp mind and a strong will. Margaret nearly dropped her fork. You spoke with my father about me, Benjamin nodded. When we discussed the land sale, he worried about your future. He looked away, suddenly awkward. I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but I think he intended to set aside money for you. He mentioned plans to ensure you were provided for. The revelation struck Margaret like a physical blow. Had her father truly cared for her future, or was this stranger merely being kind? The fever took him quickly, she said softly. Perhaps he didn't have time to tell me his plans. They ate in silence for a moment, the weight of what might have been hanging between them. If we're to work together, Benjamin finally said, I should know more about you. Margaret straightened her shoulders. There's little to tell. My parents brought me here from Ohio when I was 12. We've farmed this land, she corrected herself bitterly, this small parcel ever since. My mother died last winter, my father 3 months after. No siblings, no other family, she shook her head. None, and you, Mr. Xavier, what brings a cattleman to Sioux Falls? Ben, please, he said. I grew up in Nebraska, worked cattle across 5 territories, and decided it was time to put down roots. Your father's land was affordable and had everything I needed. He grinned. And please don't think me completely altruistic in my offer. Having someone who knows the local land, weather, and people will be invaluable to me. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself relaxing in Benjamin Xavier's company. His manner was direct but kind, his plans for the ranch sound. By the time he prepared to leave, she had decided to accept his offer. I'll return tomorrow morning, he said, standing in her doorway. We'll visit the bank together, then collect your belongings. The cabin on my property isn't much, but it's weathertight and has separate quarters for you to ensure your privacy. Margaret nodded, unexpected emotion tightening her throat. She was leaving the only home she'd known since childhood, but staying meant certain ruin. Until tomorrow, then, she said. Benjamin settled his hat on his head and offered one last smile. Rest well, Miss Grayson. Things will look brighter in the morning. As she watched him ride away, Margaret wondered if she'd made a wise decision or merely exchanged one precarious situation for another. Yet as she prepared for bed, her stomach full for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, hope that tomorrow might actually be better than today. The next morning dawned clear and warm for early May. Margaret packed her meager belongings, including her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, and the quilt her grandmother had made for her parents' wedding. Everything fit into a single trunk. Benjamin arrived promptly at 9, driving a sturdy wagon. After loading her trunk, they traveled to the bank in town. The bank manager, a thin man named Perkins, confirmed Benjamin's story. He produced the deed showing the sale of 300 acres to Benjamin Xavier, with a 1-acre parcel reserved for Margaret's homestead. Your father received $800 for the land, Perkins explained, adjusting his spectacles. He deposited it in an account in your name, Miss Grayson, but withdrew it 3 months later, shortly before his passing. Margaret's heart sank. Did he say what it was for? Perkins shook his head. Bank business is confidential, madam. Benjamin cleared his throat. Well, that confirms our arrangement was legitimate. Miss Grayson has agreed to come work at my ranch. I'd like to open an account where I can deposit her wages. The formality of the gesture wasn't lost on Margaret. By ensuring her wages went directly to the bank, Benjamin was establishing that their arrangement was strictly professional, protecting both her reputation and his. As they left the bank, Margaret noticed Josiah Blackwater watching them from across the street, his expression calculating. Benjamin followed her gaze. "Someone you know?" he asked. "Someone I'd prefer not to know," she replied. Before they could reach the wagon, Blackwater approached, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him as a man of means. "Miss Grayson," he said, tipping his hat. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I was expecting to see you at my establishment yesterday evening." "I found other employment, Mr. Blackwater," Margaret replied stiffly. Blackwater's gaze shifted to Benjamin, assessing him with obvious disdain. "And who might this be?" "Benjamin Xavier," Ben said, extending his hand. "I've purchased the old Grayson property. Miss Grayson has agreed to help manage my ranch operations." Blackwater ignored the offered handshake. "How convenient for you both." His tone made the innocent words sound vulgar. Benjamin's expression hardened. "Miss Grayson's reputation will be protected at all times while she's in my employ. I've arranged separate accommodations and have hired additional hands who will arrive shortly." "Very proper," Blackwater said with a smirk, "though I doubt the good people of Sioux Falls will see it that way." He turned back to Margaret. "When this arrangement inevitably fails, my offer remains open." "That won't be necessary," Margaret said, lifting her chin. "Good day, Mr. Blackwater." As they drove out of town, Margaret could feel her cheeks burning with humiliation. "I apologize for that unpleasantness." "No apology needed," Benjamin replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "Men like Blackwater exist in every town I've passed through. They mistake money for character." They rode in silence for a while before Benjamin spoke again. "I should warn you that there will be talk. A single woman working for a single man, living on his property even with separate accommodations. Some people will gossip." "Let them," Margaret said with more bravado than she felt. "I've survived worse than wagging tongues." The ride to Benjamin's property took nearly an hour. As they crossed the creek that had once marked the southern boundary of her father's land, Margaret felt a pang of loss mixed with curiosity. She'd rarely ventured this far from the cabin. "There it is," Benjamin said, gesturing ahead to where a small cabin sat nestled against a stand of cottonwood trees. Beyond it, a larger structure was under construction, its timber frame standing like a skeleton against the sky. "The smaller cabin was here when I bought the land. It'll be your quarters. I'm building the main house just over there. The bunkhouse for the hands will go behind it." The cabin was indeed small, but as Benjamin had promised, it was sound. The interior consisted of one room with a stone fireplace, a small table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a clean mattress and shelves for storage. "It's not much," Benjamin said, sounding almost apologetic, "but it's private. The main house will have a proper kitchen where you can cook for the ranch, but you're welcome to prepare your own meals here if you prefer." Margaret ran her hand over the rough-hewn table. The cabin was humble but clean and solid, far better than many lived with on the frontier. "It's more than adequate," she assured him. "Thank you." "Good," Benjamin said, visibly relieved. "I'll bring your trunk. The cattle arrive day after tomorrow along with my hands. Until then, I thought you might help me plan the kitchen in the main house." "I'm afraid I haven't given much thought to what a proper ranch kitchen needs." For the remainder of the day, Margaret helped Benjamin organize supplies and plan the layout of the ranch house kitchen. His ideas were practical but basic, and she found herself suggesting improvements he readily embraced. "You have a good mind for this," he commented as they sketched the kitchen layout on a piece of paper. "I'd have put the stove against the wrong wall and smoked us all out." My mother always said that the person who cooks should design the kitchen, Margaret replied, surprised to find herself smiling at the memory instead of feeling the usual pang of grief. That evening, they ate a simple supper in Margaret's cabin. Benjamin had brought enough supplies to last until the cattle drive arrived with additional provisions. "I should let you rest," he said afterward. "Tomorrow we'll need to prepare for the cattle and hands. It'll be a busy day." Margaret nodded, suddenly aware of how alone they were. Despite Benjamin's respectful behavior, she was acutely conscious of propriety. As if reading her thoughts, he stood and moved toward the door. "I've made up a bedroll in the partially built house," he said. "I'll be close enough if you need anything, but far enough for appearances." His consideration touched her. "Thank you." Benjamin paused at the door. "Miss Grayson, Margaret, if I may, I want you to know that I intend to honor our arrangement. You have my word that you'll be treated with respect here." "I believe you," she said, and was surprised to realize it was true. The next day was indeed busy. They cleared space for the incoming cattle, organized supplies, and continued work on the main house. Margaret was impressed by Benjamin's knowledge of construction and his tireless work ethic. Despite her attempts to mask her physical weakness from months of insufficient food, he seemed to notice when she tired and found ways to assign her less strenuous tasks without making her feel incapable. By evening, they'd accomplished a great deal. After supper, Benjamin brought out a ledger book. "I mentioned keeping accounts as part of your duties," he said. "I've never been particularly good with figures. Would you mind taking a look?" Margaret took the book, flipping through pages of Benjamin's untidy but earnest bookkeeping. "You've been quite thorough, but there are some improvements we could make to track expenses better." She explained a simpler system her father had used, and Benjamin listened attentively, asking questions that revealed a keen mind beneath his practical exterior. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself growing increasingly comfortable in his presence. "You mentioned you worked cattle drives for 8 years, she said. "Why decide to settle now?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I watched a friend die last year, trail accident. Made me realize I didn't want to spend my whole life passing through places, never building anything that would last." He glanced up at her. "What about you? Have you ever thought of leaving Sioux Falls?" Margaret considered the question. "Before my parents died, I sometimes dreamed of going east for education. My mother had books about women's colleges, but that was before. Dreams don't have to die with loved ones," Benjamin said gently. "Some do," she replied. "Or at least they change." The next morning, they rose early to prepare for the arrival of the cattle and ranch hands. Benjamin seemed unusually quiet as they worked, and Margaret wondered if he was having second thoughts about their arrangement. "Is everything all right?" she finally asked as they organized the supply shed. Benjamin straightened, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just thinking about all that needs to be done. Once the men and cattle arrive, things will move quickly." By mid-afternoon, a dust cloud on the horizon signaled the approach of the cattle drive. Margaret watched from the porch of her cabin as nearly 60 head of cattle moved across the landscape, guided by 3 riders. Benjamin rode out to meet them, greeting the men with handshakes and back slaps that spoke of genuine camaraderie. He led them back toward the ranch, making introductions when they reached the yard. "Miss Grayson, these are the men I told you about. This is Samuel Tucker." He indicated a weathered man in his 40s with a salt and pepper beard, and the Wilson brothers, James and Daniel. The men tipped their hats respectfully. They were trail-worn but carried themselves with the quiet confidence of experienced cowboys. "Miss Grayson will be managing the ranch operations," Benjamin explained. "You'll respect her authority as you would mine." Samuel Tucker raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Yes, sir. Welcome to the outfit, madam." The Wilson brothers, who appeared to be in their early 20s, exchanged glances but offered polite greetings. Margaret could read their skepticism but appreciated Benjamin's clear establishment of her role. The next few days fell into a rhythm of hard work. Margaret took over meal preparation and bookkeeping while learning about the cattle operation. Benjamin proved to be a patient teacher, explaining the intricacies of ranching without condescension. The hands, too, gradually accepted her presence, especially after her first supper demonstrated cooking skills far superior to their trail fare. 2 weeks into the arrangement, Margaret was recording the day's expenses in the ledger when a knock came at her cabin door. She opened it to find Benjamin, hat in hand. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "Not at all." She stepped aside to let him enter. Benjamin placed a package wrapped in brown paper on the table. "I was in town today for supplies and thought you might need this." Margaret unwrapped the package to find a length of practical but pretty blue cotton fabric, enough for a new dress, along with thread and buttons. "I noticed your dress is wearing thin," he explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "I asked the shopkeeper what a respectable working woman might need." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. "This is very kind, but you didn't need to. It's not charity," Benjamin said quickly. "Consider it part of your wages. A ranch manager should look the part." Margaret smiled, running her fingers over the fabric. "Thank you, I'll start on it this evening." Benjamin shifted his weight, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "There's something else. The Founders' Day dance is next Saturday in town. I thought perhaps you might like to attend, as my guest, of course." The invitation surprised her. "A dance?" "You don't have to decide now," he added hastily. "I just thought you might enjoy an evening of music and company beyond the ranch." Margaret considered the offer. A public appearance at Benjamin's side would certainly fuel gossip, but it would also establish that he considered her a respectable companion, not a secret dalliance. "I'd be pleased to attend," she said. Benjamin's face brightened with a smile that transformed his features from handsome to striking. "Excellent. I'll arrange for the wagon." After he left, Margaret examined the fabric more closely. The blue was the color of a summer sky, coincidentally, the same shade as Benjamin's eyes. She wondered if he'd noticed the similarity when selecting it. As she worked on sewing the new dress over the next several evenings, Margaret found her thoughts increasingly occupied by Benjamin Xavier. He was unlike any man she'd known, straightforward yet considerate, strong yet gentle. She admired his work ethic and his vision for the ranch, which grew more impressive as each day passed. The cattle were thriving on the lush spring grass. The main house was nearly complete, with Margaret's suggestions for the kitchen implemented exactly as she'd recommended. The bunkhouse for the hands was under construction, and Benjamin had begun planning for hay fields to provide winter feed. Most surprising was how seamlessly Margaret had fit into the operation. The hands now came directly to her with supply requests and routine concerns, saving Benjamin's attention for more significant decisions. She found satisfaction in the work, honest labor that produced tangible results. By the evening of the dance, her new dress was finished. The simple design was enhanced by careful stitching and thoughtful details. When Benjamin arrived to escort her to town, his appreciative gaze made her cheeks warm. "You look lovely, Margaret," he said, using her given name as had become his habit when they were alone. "Thank you." She smoothed the skirt nervously. "It's been some time since I attended a social function." Benjamin offered his arm. "Then I'm honored to escort you back into society." The town hall was decorated with paper streamers and wildflowers for the Founders' Day celebration. A small band played lively tunes while couples danced and neighbors visited. Margaret was acutely aware of the curious glances and whispers that followed their entrance, but Benjamin's steady presence beside her gave her courage. Sheriff Miller approached them first, greeting Benjamin with a hearty handshake. "Xavier, heard you finally settled down on that land you bought, and Miss Grayson, it's good to see you out and about." "Miss Grayson has been instrumental in establishing my ranch," Benjamin said. "I couldn't have accomplished half as much without her expertise." The sheriff's wife, a plump, friendly woman, joined them. "It's wonderful to see young people making a success on the frontier. So many give up and head back east at the first sign of hardship." As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself relaxing. Most of the townspeople were welcoming, even if their curiosity was thinly veiled. Benjamin remained attentive, introducing her to those he knew and ensuring she never stood alone. When the band struck up a waltz, Benjamin turned to her. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Margaret hesitated. "It's been years since I danced." "I promise not to hold it against you if you step on my toes," he said with that smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. She took his hand, and he led her onto the dance floor. Benjamin proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her with confidence. The warmth of his hand at her waist, the strength of his shoulders beneath her fingers, and the subtle scent of soap and leather that surrounded him combined to make Margaret acutely aware of him not just as her employer, but as a man. "You dance very well for a cowboy," she remarked, trying to distract herself from these unsettling thoughts. Benjamin chuckled. "My mother insisted all her sons learn. Said a man who could dance would never lack for female company." "A wise woman," Margaret replied, smiling. As they turned, Margaret caught sight of Josiah Blackwater watching them from across the room, his expression dark. Benjamin followed her gaze and subtly adjusted their position, placing himself between Margaret and Blackwater's line of sight. "He's been watching us since we arrived," Benjamin murmured. "Mr. Blackwater doesn't like losing," Margaret said, "especially to someone he considers beneath him." "And what do you consider me?" Benjamin asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Before Margaret could answer, the music ended. Benjamin escorted her to the refreshment table, where they were joined by several of the town's merchants and their wives. The conversation turned to business prospects in the region, and Benjamin spoke confidently about his plans for the ranch. "With the railroad coming through next year, beef prices should remain strong," he explained. "I plan to expand the herd significantly." Margaret listened with interest, impressed by his foresight. When asked her opinion on the ranch's prospects, she found herself speaking with an authority that surprised even her, outlining their plans for crop rotation to support the cattle and potential markets for excess produce. "You two make quite the partnership," observed Mrs. Miller approvingly. The casual comment brought Margaret up short. Did others see them as a couple rather than employer and employee? More concerning, why did the idea not trouble her as it should? As the evening drew to a close, Benjamin suggested they start back to the ranch. They had just reached the wagon when Josiah Blackwater intercepted them, his breath betraying that he'd visited the flask in his pocket more than once. "Miss Grayson," he said, ignoring Benjamin completely, "you're looking well. Domestic service clearly agrees with you." The implied insult wasn't lost on either of them. Benjamin stepped forward. "Miss Grayson is the manager of my ranch, Mr. Blackwater, not a domestic servant." Blackwater's lip curled. "Is that what they're calling it these days? Tell me, Xavier, do all your ranch managers share such?" "Close quarters with you," Benjamin's hands clenched into fists. "You're addressing a lady, sir. Mind your tongue." "A lady," Blackwater laughed. "A destitute orphan living on a bachelor's property. The whole town knows what arrangement you've made." Before Benjamin could respond, Margaret placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Mr. Blackwater, your offer was considered and rejected. Your opinion of me is of no consequence." Her calm dignity seemed to inflame Blackwater further. "You'll regret your choice when Xavier here moves on to greener pastures. Cowboys don't stay put, girl. When he leaves, my door will still be open, though my offer may not be as generous." Benjamin moved so quickly that Margaret barely registered it before he had Blackwater by the collar, lifting the smaller man until he stood on his toes. "Apologize to Miss Grayson," Benjamin said, his voice dangerously quiet. Blackwater struggled ineffectually. "Take your hands off me." "I'll have the sheriff arrest you for assault." "The sheriff is watching right now," Benjamin replied evenly. "And I believe he'd agree you owe the lady an apology." Indeed, Sheriff Miller had stepped outside and was observing the confrontation with narrowed eyes but making no move to intervene. Blackwater's face flushed with humiliation. "My apologies, Miss Grayson," he muttered. "I spoke out of turn." Benjamin released him and Blackwater stumbled back, straightening his expensive jacket with shaking hands. "This isn't over, Xavier," he hissed before stalking away. The ride back to the ranch was silent for several miles. Finally, Benjamin spoke. "I apologize for losing my temper. That man brings out the worst in me." "He has that effect on most people," Margaret replied. "But thank you for defending my honor." Benjamin glanced at her. "I meant what I told those people tonight. You're essential to the ranch's success. I couldn't do this without you." His words warmed her more than they should have. "I enjoy the work," she said simply. "Just the work?" he asked, his voice softening. Margaret looked at him in the moonlight, his profile strong against the night sky. "The company has been unexpectedly pleasant as well," she admitted. Benjamin smiled, and they rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. The weeks that followed brought increasing prosperity to the ranch. Benjamin's cattle thrived, and the main house was completed, including the kitchen that had become Margaret's domain. She took pride in creating a warm, efficient space where she prepared meals for the hands and conducted the business of the ranch. Her relationship with Benjamin evolved as well. Their evenings often included discussions of the ranch's operations that gradually gave way to more personal conversations. She learned about his childhood in Nebraska, his parents who still farmed there, and his 3 older brothers who had all sought their fortunes elsewhere. He, in turn, listened as she spoke of her mother's dreams for her education and her father's struggles with the land. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch of the main house watching a spectacular sunset paint the Dakota sky in shades of gold and crimson, Benjamin turned to her. "Margaret, there's something I've been meaning to ask you," he began. Before he could continue, Samuel Tucker rode into the yard at a gallop, his horse lathered with exertion. "Boss," he called out. "Storm coming in from the northwest. Looks bad." Benjamin was on his feet immediately. "How much time?" "Hour, maybe less," Sam replied. "Wilson boys are already moving the herd to the south pasture by the bluffs." Benjamin turned to Margaret. "We need to secure everything. Can you handle the barn while I help Sam with the livestock?" "Of course," she replied, already moving. The approaching storm painted the horizon black, the churning clouds occasionally illuminated by lightning. Margaret worked quickly, ensuring the barn doors and windows were secure and the horses settled. She was checking the last stall when Benjamin rushed in. "Wind's picking up," he said. "We need to get to the house." They barely made it inside before the storm hit with ferocious intensity. Wind howled around the eaves as rain lashed against the windows. Margaret moved through the house, lighting lamps and stoking the stove for warmth. "The men?" she asked. "Safe in the bunkhouse," Benjamin assured her. They got the cattle into the protected pasture before the worst hit. A tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, making Margaret jump. Benjamin moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "I've never seen a storm hit this fast," he murmured. Margaret joined him at the window. The rain was coming down in sheets now, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Another flash of lightning revealed the landscape for an instant, and Margaret gasped. "The creek. Benjamin, look at the creek." The usually docile stream that ran through the property had swollen to a raging torrent, its banks already overflowing. "My cabin," Margaret said, suddenly remembering. "It's right by the creek." Benjamin's expression turned grim. "Stay here," he ordered, moving toward the door. "I'm coming with you," Margaret insisted, grabbing a slicker from the hook by the door. The argument was cut short by a frantic pounding. Benjamin opened the door to find James Wilson, the younger of the brothers, drenched and wide-eyed. "The dam's burst upstream," he gasped. "Wall of water coming." "The cattle, get back to the bunkhouse," Benjamin ordered. "Wake your brother and Sam. Get to high ground immediately. We'll meet you there." As James raced back into the storm, Benjamin turned to Margaret. "We don't have much time. The cabin's lost. We need to focus on saving the herd." Margaret swallowed her dismay. Everything she owned was in that cabin. "What can I do?" "Help me round up the horses from the corral," he said. "We need to move fast." They battled their way through wind and rain to the corral, where the horses were nervously circling. Benjamin quickly saddled 2 mounts while Margaret calmed the others. Together, they rode toward the south pasture where the cattle had been moved. The journey was treacherous. Twice, Margaret's horse nearly lost its footing on the increasingly muddy ground. The creek, now a raging river, roared to their right, carrying debris and uprooted trees in its furious current. They crested a small rise and saw the cattle below, huddled against the bluffs. Sam and Daniel were desperately trying to drive them higher up the slope, but the frightened animals were resisting. "The water's coming," Benjamin shouted, pointing upstream where a wall of churning darkness was visible even through the rain, bearing down on them with terrifying speed. Margaret didn't hesitate. She urged her horse forward, circling wide to get behind the herd. Benjamin followed her lead, and together they began driving the cattle upward. Sam and Daniel, seeing their approach, redoubled their efforts. The flood hit with a roar that drowned out even the thunder. Margaret watched in horror as the leading edge of water swept away the lower portion of the herd. Cattle bellowed in panic as they were carried downstream. "Higher," Benjamin shouted. "Get them higher." For what seemed like hours, they fought to save as many cattle as possible, driving them ever upward as the flood waters rose beneath them. Margaret's arms ached, and her voice grew hoarse from shouting, but she pressed on, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Finally, the remaining cattle, perhaps 30 head, were secured on higher ground. The rain began to slacken, and the first light of dawn revealed the devastation below. The entire valley was underwater, including where both Margaret's cabin and the main ranch house had stood. Benjamin dismounted beside her, his face etched with exhaustion. "Are you all right?" Margaret nodded, too tired to speak. Her dress was plastered to her skin, her hair had come loose from its pins, and she was covered in mud, but she was alive. Sam approached, leading his horse. "Lost about half the herd, boss, maybe more. Won't know until the water recedes," Benjamin nodded grimly. "What matters is that everyone's safe. We can rebuild." His eyes met Margaret's, and she read the unspoken question. Would she stay now after this setback, my cabin? She asked, already knowing the answer. Benjamin shook his head. "I'm sorry, Margaret. It was directly in the path of the flood. Everything is gone." The loss struck her harder than she'd expected. Her parents' Bible, her grandmother's quilt, the last connections to her family, swept away in an instant. Benjamin must have read the devastation in her face because he moved closer, his voice gentle. "We'll rebuild it, better than before." "The main house?" she asked. "Built on higher ground, thankfully. It likely sustained damage but should be salvageable." As they led the surviving cattle to temporary grazing grounds beyond the flood's reach, Margaret tried to process all that had happened. In a single night, the promising new life she'd begun to build had been swept away. Yet as she watched Benjamin organizing the men, his determination unwavering despite the disaster, she found her own resolve strengthening. When they finally returned to assess the damage to the main house, they found it standing but severely damaged. The lower floor had been flooded and mud covered everything. The barn was in worse condition, its rear wall partially collapsed. "We'll start with the house," Benjamin decided. "Get it livable again, then rebuild the barn and your cabin." Margaret surveyed the muddy interior that had been her pride just yesterday. "It will take weeks." "Then we'd better get started," Benjamin said, rolling up his sleeves. The next days were a blur of exhausting labor. Neighbors from miles around came to help, bringing food and supplies. Even Sheriff Miller rode out from town with a wagon of provisions. "Blackwater's telling everyone in town your ranch is finished," Miller told Benjamin as they worked to repair the barn. "Says you'll be selling out by winter." Benjamin straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mr. Blackwater will be disappointed then. I'm not going anywhere," the sheriff nodded approvingly. "Good to hear. Town needs more men like you, those who stick when things get tough." His gaze shifted to where Margaret was directing two men in salvaging kitchen equipment. "She's something special too. Never seen a woman work like that." Benjamin watched Margaret, his expression softening. "Yes, she is." With no private quarters available, Margaret had been sleeping in the kitchen once it was cleaned, while Benjamin and the hands camped in what remained of the barn. Despite the lack of privacy and comfort, she found herself drawn more deeply into the life of the ranch. The disaster had forged a bond between all of them, a shared determination to rebuild. One evening, about 2 weeks after the flood, Benjamin found Margaret sitting on the repaired porch steps, staring at the sunset. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She moved over and he sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "I spoke with the builder today," he said. "Your cabin will be ready within the month. We're building it on higher ground with a proper stone foundation." "Thank you," she said, "though I've grown accustomed to the main house." Benjamin glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "Have you? It's a fine house," she said carefully. "You designed it well." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken thoughts. "Margaret," Benjamin finally said, "before the flood I was about to ask you something." Her heart quickened. "Yes. These past months, working alongside you, getting to know you." He took a breath. "My feelings for you have grown beyond admiration for your abilities. I find myself thinking of you constantly, caring for you deeply." Margaret stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I know this isn't the most romantic setting," he continued with a self-deprecating smile, gesturing at the mud-stained porch and half-repaired house. "And my timing is probably terrible, but the flood made me realize how quickly everything can change. I don't want to waste another day without telling you how I feel." "Benjamin," she began, but he held up a hand. "Please let me finish. I'm not asking for an answer now. I know you came here out of necessity, not choice. But I want you to know that I love you, Margaret Grayson. Not as my ranch manager or housekeeper, but as the remarkable woman you are. If you could consider a future with me not as my employee, but as my wife, it would make me the happiest man in the Dakota Territory." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. When she'd first met Benjamin Xavier, she'd been desperate and hungry, with no options left. He'd offered her dignity when others would have exploited her vulnerability. In the months since, she'd come to respect his integrity, admire his work ethic, and yes, love his gentle strength and unwavering kindness. "I don't need time to consider," she said softly. "My answer is yes." Benjamin's eyes widened. "Yes, truly," Margaret smiled through her tears. "When I came here, I was running from something: hunger, shame, desperation. But these past months, I've been running toward something instead: a future, a home." She reached for his hand. "A love I never expected to find." Benjamin pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When their lips met, Margaret felt as though all the hardship, all the loss that had brought her to this moment, had been worthwhile. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I think I have for some time," he smiled, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then we're agreed, partners in all things from this day forward." They were married 3 weeks later in the newly repaired main house, with Sheriff Miller officiating and the ranch hands serving as witnesses. Margaret wore a dress of creamy white fabric that Benjamin had ordered specially from Sioux Falls, and he wore a new black suit that made him look impossibly handsome. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When Benjamin spoke his vows, promising to cherish and protect her all the days of his life, Margaret felt a certainty she'd never known before. This was right. This was where she belonged. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered new dimensions to their partnership, a physical passion that matched the emotional connection they'd built over the months. In Benjamin's tender embrace, Margaret found a completion she hadn't known was possible. As summer turned to fall, the ranch flourished under their joint care. The flood damage was repaired, new cattle purchased to replace those lost, and plans made for expansion. Margaret's former cabin, rebuilt on higher ground, became a storehouse for the increasing harvests from the kitchen garden she'd established. On a crisp October morning, Margaret stood on the porch of their home, watching Benjamin work with a new colt in the corral. The strength and patience he showed with the animal were the same qualities that had drawn her to him, the same qualities that made him an exceptional husband. "You're staring, Mrs. Xavier," he called with a grin, looking up and catching her eye. "Simply admiring the view, Mr. Xavier," she replied with a smile of her own. He secured the colt and walked to the porch, taking off his hat as he approached. "And what has you looking so pleased this morning?" Margaret took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I believe our family will be expanding come spring." Benjamin's face transformed with wonder. "A baby, you're certain?" She nodded, joy bubbling up inside her. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday when he came to check on Sam's arm." Benjamin whooped with delight, lifting her off her feet and spinning her in a circle. "Margaret Xavier, you make me happier every day." As he set her down gently, his face grew serious. "I promise you, our child will never know hunger or shame or desperation. Our family will always have options, good ones." Margaret touched his face tenderly. "I know. That's the gift you gave me, Benjamin. Not just food or shelter when I needed it most, but dignity. A chance to build something meaningful." Benjamin pulled her close, his voice soft against her hair. "You're wrong about one thing. The gift was mine. When you agreed to come work for me, I gained a partner I never dreamed possible. Everything we've built together." In the years that followed, the Xavier Ranch became one of the most prosperous in the territory. They welcomed 3 children, 2 sons, and a daughter who grew strong in the Dakota sunshine, surrounded by love and the example of their parents' partnership. Josiah Blackwater eventually left Sioux Falls after his establishments failed, unable to compete with the legitimate businesses that flourished as the town grew. The last Margaret heard, He'd moved further west, always chasing opportunity but never finding satisfaction. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Benjamin surprised Margaret with a special gift admission papers to a women's college in St. Paul for the following year. "The children are old enough now," he explained when she protested that she couldn't leave. "Sam can manage the ranch with me for a term. This was your dream once. I think you should have the chance to fulfill it." Margaret did attend for 2 terms, studying literature and science with enthusiasm. When she returned, she established a small school on their property for their children and those of neighboring ranchers. On warm summer evenings, Benjamin and Margaret often sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard that had once been underwater. Sometimes they spoke of the flood and all they had lost, but more often they marveled at what they had gained, a love that had begun with a simple offer of dignity and grown into a lifetime of partnership. "You ever regret it?" Benjamin asked her once. "Coming to work for me when you had other options?" Margaret smiled, remembering the desperate young woman she'd been, facing the impossible choice between hunger and shame. "I didn't have other options," she corrected gently. "I had desperate measures. You offered me something different, a chance to keep my dignity while finding my way forward." She took his hand, her fingers lacing with his as they had countless times over the years. "You didn't just feed me, Benjamin. You saw me, my value, my potential. That was the true gift." Benjamin kissed her hand, his eyes as blue and clear as they'd been that first day on her doorstep. "I saw the woman I would love for the rest of my life. I just didn't know it yet." As the Dakota sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that sometimes the hardest choices led to the most beautiful destinations. What had begun as a desperate bargain had blossomed into a love story written across the rolling plains of their shared life, a story of dignity offered and accepted, of partnership forged in adversity, and of a love that had transformed them both.